Good evening. My name is Helen Withycombe and I'm the Head of Programming at the Wheeler Centre. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of these lands, the Wurundjeri and the Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging. This is, was and always will be Aboriginal land. It's my great pleasure to introduce tonight's guest, a man who needs very little introduction. Alongside his distinguished career as a human rights lawyer, Geoffrey Robertson has, for 30 years, enjoyed a parallel career as an author and broadcaster. His books on war crimes, free speech and the Vatican have shaped public debates, while his famous television series, Geoffrey Robertson's Hypotheticals, schooled generations in the discipline of Socratic questioning. His latest book is rather his own man, and it is being sold here tonight by the wonderful folk from the Sun Bookshop. Geoffrey will be signing copies after the event in the Athenaeum foyer, and I urge you all to purchase a copy. The book tells the colourful story of his life, from his Rhodes Scholarship at Oxford to the epic legal battles that have taken him to the UK Supreme Court and the European Court of Human Rights, as well as his personal and professional entanglements with everyone from General Pinochet and Princess Diana, Nigella Lawson and Kathy Lette, to Salman Rushdie and Julian Assange. Throughout it all, Geoffrey has held on to his irreverence, his principles, and his commitments to human rights. Please join me in welcoming to the stage a figure of uncommon energy, glamour, and intellect, Geoffrey Robertson.
Thank you. Hi. Oh, hello, Melbourne. It's great to be here from the ice age of England last week to the sunny uplands of Melbourne. I live in England, although I grew up in Sydney in the 50s and 60s, and now I'm a dual citizen. One of those people the High Court last year ruled could never be elected to federal parliament. It comes as a great relief. But it's useful to be a dual citizen. It means I can get my prostate felt in London's Harley Street and my teeth fixed in Sydney's Macquarie Street. If you've ever seen an Englishman smile, you'll understand why. But in spite of all temptations to belong to other nations, I remain an Australian expatriate, not an Australian expatriate. And I've just reached the age of 70 years and 10, the Bible's estimate of your sentient life. So I'm in my anecdotage, and I've written an autobiography. It's been an opportunity, actually, to think back on how Australia has changed, how dramatically it's changed in my lifetime. Only 50 years ago, an Australian Prime Minister, one Harold Holt, could announce, "Australia is all the way with LBJ." Today, another Australian Prime Minister is declaring Australia will take a dump for Donald Trump. Plus ça change, as the French might say. Mind you, speaking entirely for myself, I find Mr. Trump an inspiration. He's older than me. And just look at what he's capable of. He's a deal maker, a cynical deal maker who knows the price of everything and the value of nothing. Now, because this is an autobiography, I had to say something about my forebears. I knew nothing about them until I made the mistake of accepting to have that television program, Who Do You Think You Are? I went on it. My mother counseled against it. She said, oh, they might find something embarrassing about our ancestors. And they did. They found that I was a Hohenzollern. Of all things, that I sprang from an illegitimate relationship between Prince Wilhelm, later Kaiser Wilhelm I of Germany, and a low-rated Polish princess, Princess Radziwill. And their illegitimate daughter was sent out to Australia in 1848 to escape the European revolutions. So I'm actually related, as the DNA says, to the British royal family, the Saxe-Coburg-Gothas, who changed their name to Windsor in 1917 to pretend that they weren't related to the enemy. And this is all very embarrassing for a Republican. I have been a Republican since the age of 7, since 1954, when, as a schoolboy, like every other schoolboy and schoolgirl in Sydney and Melbourne, I was forced into the Sydney cricket ground. At that stage, I suppose the Melbourne cricket ground was the equivalent. The temperature on the day was over 95 degrees. We had to wait 4 hours until the young Queen emerged in a closed car and sped around the ground while kids were collapsing with sunstroke all around me. But our Prime Minister was a fanatic royalist. And a little later he said of the Queen, "I did but see her passing by, and yet I'll love her till I die." At the age of 7, I did but see her passing by, but so quickly it made me a lifelong Republican. Of course, now I'm a Queen's Counsel, Cathy and I get invited quite often to Buckingham Palace, invitations that we graciously accept. And we get criticized by Australia's more common commentators, Gerald Henderson and Andrew Bolt, for betraying our Republican principles. They don't seem to understand the virtues of politeness, or Cathy's point about going to Buck House. Of course, they're dinosaurs, but who wouldn't want to see dinosaurs in their natural habitat? I was at Buck House a couple of weeks ago. I'm very pleased to tell you that Australia's head of state is in fine form. Her memory is excellent. We chatted about the time some years ago when Cathy made her laugh by wearing a dress imprinted with corgis. And she remembered it well. Phil the Greek has retired, but his place was taken by Charles and Camilla. It was an event for the Commonwealth, and there were all the representatives, the high commissioners of 53 Commonwealth countries. I spent my time, some of the time, chatting to our man in England, Alexander Downer, who's looking forward. He can't wait to retire to England, of course. And the object of the exercise was part of the campaign that is being waged by the Palace and by the government of the United Kingdom at the moment to have Charles elected as head of the Commonwealth. This is quite a campaign. Julia Gillard let slip that when she was Prime Minister, they'd sent a flunky off from Buckingham Palace to persuade her to vote for Charles, cast Australia's vote for Charles. Malcolm Turnbull may have other ideas, and the Black Commonwealth certainly has its doubts about Charles. They believe the Commonwealth needs an inspiring head, and members of the Black Commonwealth are not happy, but the lobbying continues apace. And the interesting thing about head of the Commonwealth is that it's not hereditary. And who will get it now that Aung San Suu Kyi has blotted her copybook over the Rohingyas? And they're all that you need to be head of the Commonwealth is to have a parent born in a Commonwealth country. And as luck would have it, the perfect, the most inspirational, leader is now available, who needs a job, can stand up to the stupidities of Donald Trump. And his father was born in Kenya. Australia should vote for Barack Obama as the next head of the Commonwealth. Now I'm here, I want to pay tribute to some of the Victorians who influenced my life. I've got to be very careful. The last time I said something rude about a much-loved Victorian at the Hamer Hall, people walked out in protest when I dared to criticize Ned Kelly, the terrorist. So, and he was, but I won't go there. But there was a Victorian who greatly assisted my sex life and my love of literature, and to him I will pay tribute, because sex in the 50s, sex education, was virtually non-existent. There was one group, the father and son movement, incorporating mother and daughter limited. So at all schools in Sydney and Melbourne, once a year, embarrassed fathers had to sit with their more embarrassed sons, watching pictures of tadpoles heading for cartoon uteruses, and being told that all about venereal disease. They were terrifying events. The most terrible event, the most terrible disease would come if you happened to have sex with anyone other than your wife. And they were militantly opposed to masturbation. You were told that masturbation rotted backbones and caused blindness, and worst of all, perpetual adolescence. There was pictures, I remember, of a boy on a rocking chair. Growing up means leaving childish things behind. It was, you played with your sex organs if you were at primary school, but when you became a teenager, then they sort of curled up until you got married. It was all too silly for words, and we really had no sex education, no guidance, until the state of Victoria produced Arthur Rylah, the Attorney General. Now, Arthur Rylah was terribly important to our sex education because he announced that he was going to ban in Victoria all books that were not fit for his 14-year-old daughter. And Rabelais dictu, he issued a list of the books that he was going to ban. So we 14-year-old kids in New South Wales started to hunt them up, and we found them in our school library. Mary McCarthy's The Group, Erskine Caldwell's God's Little Acre. They were thumbed by boys who would never, had it not been for Arthur Rylah, would never have read them. So we learnt about sex, thanks to that rather pompous Puritan. The other Victorian who influenced my career was, of course, Sir Robert Menzies, the notorious Anglophile and royalist. I was one of Ming's kids. I mean, he spanned Australia like a colossus in the 50s and 60s. And he was an obsessive Anglophile. He even insisted for a while, until people laughed so much it didn't come to pass, that the new Australian decimal currency should be called the Royal. So this book would cost you 45 royals had he had his way. But he was such an Anglophile that when a British jury in 1960 acquitted Penguin Books for publishing Lady Chatterley's Lover, everyone assumed that Menzies would follow that British decision. And we lived next door to Fred Osborne, who was in Menzies' cabinet, and he told me exactly what happened. That Bob Menzies stormed into his cabinet waving a copy of the book which he'd just read. and said, "I'm not going to allow my wife to read this book." And so the Dame Patty Menzies protection test decided how many books, what books would be allowed in to Australia. It was extraordinary. We banned books and we banned blacks. The White Australia policy was in full swing. I never saw a black face, actually, occasionally a Chinese restaurant, but the Aboriginals were put out in reserves or to throw boomerangs at La Perouse. They weren't even counted in the census. They weren't regarded as Australians until the referendum in 1967. But not only did Australia ban Lady Chatterley's Lover, it banned the little Penguin special, The Trial of Lady Chatterley. And miraculously, one courageous Sydney bookseller got all his friends in England to write out word for word The Trial of Lady Chatterley and to send them in those air letters, those long blue air letters that could go through customs as personal mail. And then he reassembled The Trial of Lady Chatterley. And it fell into my hands. I must have been 16 at the time, and it inspired me to want, eventually, to become a barrister at the Old Bailey and to do the sort of things that the barristers in the book had done to win the acquittal of reasonably great literature. So when I came to apply for scholarships, I really wanted to go to Harvard. And I thought there was a new scholarship available called the Robert Gordon Menzies Scholarship that would take me straight to Harvard. I thought, I can't go through my life as a Menzies scholar, this man who'd ordered us into Vietnam. I lost several of my schoolboy friends, blown up by mines in Da Nang province, and now just a note on the War Memorial Board. I can't live as a Menzies scholar. So I went for a Rhodes Scholarship, which I won. And of course, as soon as I got to Oxford, we realized the scandal of the Rhodes Scholarship. There'd never been a black Rhodes Scholar. So we decided immediately to give back, to threaten to return our scholarships if they didn't appoint some black Rhodes Scholars from South Africa. And this was, I must admit that I did make an inquiry as to whether the Robert Gordon Menzies Scholarship was still available. But the Rhodes Trust, fortunately, changed its policy and I stayed on. I did finally get to Victoria. You had to fly in an old Lockheed Electra, sometimes crashed in Botany Bay. I did get to Victoria as I was head of the Students' Representative Council in Sydney, and we had an organization called the National Union of Australian University Students. And there we met upstairs in a room in the Windsor pub quite often with the older generation of student politicians, Gareth Evans, Michael Kirby. Gareth was pretending to have a Ben Chifley persona. He smoked a pipe, and Michael would sing Onward Christian Soldiers and mimic Doc Evett. And I would sit as the Sydney representative down the back with Richard Carlton, who later found fame on 60 Minutes and the ABC. And I bet Richard that £10, a lot in those pre-decimal days, that Gareth would one day become Australia's foreign minister in Michael Kirby's cabinet. But of course it half happened. My great little Malcolm was still at school in those days. We called him Little Malcolm because we were doing the David Halliwell play at Sydney University, Little Malcolm and his struggle against the eunuchs. And Malcolm Turnbull, when he came up to Sydney University, always seemed to be struggling against eunuchs, and still is, by all accounts. But it was an interesting time. My great friend at these NUAUS meetings was John Bannon. He was a couple of years older, but we'd met at Sydney, at debating, intervarsity debating. I'll never forget the first time I met him. He came on, we were debating some ludicrous subject, vice is nice, or money can buy happiness. And he came on with smoking a Cuban cigar and with a bottle of Barossa Red, which he proceeded to drain before he actually spoke, with great wit and showmanship. And I thought, I've got a bond with this guy. And I did, because at these NUAUS conferences, we found that we had something in common. We both knew every patter song from Gilbert and Sullivan. So we'd get a guy with a piano and a chorus, and we'd sing out into the early hours, Gilbert and Sullivan songbook. And my daughter, who in time became a student leader, headed the Occupy London movement, occupying my flat in the Temple. And she teases me, saying, "What did you do in the 60s, Daddy? Were you arrested in an anti-Vietnam demonstration? Were you on the barricades with the French students in Paris?" I say, "No, darling, I stayed up late singing Gilbert and Sullivan with John Bannon." But it was politicians get embarrassed by their early musical taste. There was a book about David Cameron, Pig's Head Revisited, or some such book, and it depicted him at Magdalen College with smoking dope and listening to Supertramp. And he wasn't embarrassed at all about the dope smoking. He was just excruciatingly embarrassed about the revelation that he ever liked Supertramp. But ultimately, in those NUAUS days, I did something which actually qualifies me, I think, as for a footnote in South Australian history, because in 1967 there was the election for the full-time presidency of NUAUS. Now, it was not a very powerful union, but it was a stepping stone. You could go from the small toilet of president of the NUAS to the vast cesspool of the Labour Party. And the fight was between John Bannon and one of my own delegates from Sydney, Tom Roper. And I called the delegation together. I said, "Look, Tom is a great comrade. One day he'll be a very good state minister." I was good at hypotheticals in those days because he became a Victorian minister, didn't he? And but Bannon could be the first Prime Minister of Australia for our generation. It was captain's choice. So I said, Sydney will vote Bannon. And Sydney did. And that's how he got elected. And I still think that South Australia's gain may have been Australia's loss. He was a great figure. Now, the other thing that I think did inspire me from Victoria in the 60s was that you still had hanging. Henry Bolte had great affection for the noose. He tried to get a man named Tate, a mentally ill man, hanged. The High Court had to threaten him with contempt if he went ahead. And then there was Robert Ryan in 1967. Now, we were in Sydney, but I remember organising a protest outside the Victorian Tourist Bureau in Sydney. Can you imagine a time when your state had a tourist bureau in Sydney? For Victorians in the 60s, the world was small. But I was inspired by the work of the lawyers who saved Tate, the work of Philip Oppas and other Victorian lawyers who failed to save Robert Ryan. And in due course, I became a death row lawyer in the Privy Council. The Privy Council was Australia's top court of appeal, final court, until 1986. And it still is the final court of appeal for about 16 countries, many of them in the Caribbean, who still retain the death penalty. So the last chance that these men on death row have was, and still is, to have their convictions quashed or their hanging refused by the Privy Council in London. Now, I was a leading death row lawyer in the Privy Council for about 20 years, from 1975, and it's difficult as a death row lawyer because you can never, law can't strike down the death penalty because it's there in the Constitution. And so rational argument gets you nowhere. You can't say that this form of execution is wrong. Most of them have the gallows, some of them have execution by firing squad, but it can't be overturned because as a lawyer you have to work within the Constitution. And this, I mean, in Jamaica, I used to go to death rows in Jamaica and Trinidad, and they would have all the old habits of the British. When they executed people, they would never let the body go back to the relatives for a proper burial because of the giraffe effect. The British Home Office pointed out that hanging elongates the neck, and so the body couldn't be handed over to relatives. In Jamaica, they buried them in the kitchen garden and were very proud of the prizes they won for their vegetables. And it was the rituals, the weighing and the greasing of the trap, the weighing of the body, the visit of the executioner, the leaving the corpse hanging, twisting on a rope for an hour while the official party ate a cooked breakfast. It was all very gruesome and grisly. But there it is. They followed those rules. And the time that I think changed everything was a result of a visit to a death row in Trinidad, where a man called Michael X was imprisoned. He'd been convicted of murder, and he was waiting to be hanged. He had been a Black Power leader of sorts in Britain in the 60s. He was a friend of John Lennon's, who actually donated the piano on which Sgt. Pepper had been composed in order to pay for airfares. That was what we needed to get down there and help him. So I visited Michael X on death row, and it was really an horrific place. I mean, about 30 men in small monkey cages, I could best describe it, with a 8x6 with a slop bucket and a mattress. And there was a terrible cacophony. They would scream and shout. That's the thing about the death penalty. It does drive people mad. And death row was a place of really mental derangement. And I was talking to Michael, and I said, look, we've got a problem because the Constitution allows the carrying out of the death penalty, but it also bans torture. And we could say this place is a place of torture banned by the Constitution. And Michael, I'll never forget, put his finger to his lips and said, shh. I was quiet. He said, listen, just listen. You couldn't hear a pin drop. Every man on death row was clinging to the cage, to the bars nearest us, and listening. And he said, this is usually a place of total noise, and they're all listening to you because to you represent hope. And he said, you must promise me that you'll make this argument that a prolonged stay on death row amounts to torture for them, not for me, because they're going to hang me whatever happens. And they did. The death penalty brutalizes everyone involved in it, and because I had come up with an idea borrowed from the Tate case that I would use, and I was about to go to court to stay Michael's execution. So instead, they got the Governor General to sign the warrant at midnight so that he would be hung before I could get to court. And it was a promise that I worked for years to implement. And finally, in a case in '94, Pratt and Morgan against the government of Jamaica at that time, we succeeded in getting the Privy Council to rule that a prolonged stay on death row amounted to torture, and the sentence had to be commuted. It was a famous case. It was the first time for many years that the Privy Council had sat with 7 judges, because the last time they'd sat was the Australian banks nationalisation case, when 2 of them had died from listening to Doc Evatt. And so this was creating a bit of history, but it's a case that has led to over 1,000 commutations throughout the British Commonwealth, as it then was, throughout the Caribbean and throughout Africa. So that remains, I think, the case which has had the best consequences. And I do pay tribute to Philip Opass and to the lawyers when I was a young law student who were inspiring in their opposition, even though they failed, to hanging in the Balti days. Well, I did become a barrister at the Old Bailey, and I spent many years restoring people to their friends, burglars to their friends and their relations, as Gilbert and Sullivan say. But, and I dressed up in wigs and gowns. It's always, I think the greatest danger in a barrister's life comes in the robing room, where you've got to fix your stud to the stiff winged collar. And if you press a little too hard on a gland that's just below the carotid artery, it will cut off the blood supply to the brain, and you can suffer unconsciousness and possibly death. Comes in useful when you're defending a strangler. Members of the jury, he just pressed a little too hard. But we had, actually we tried to get rid of the pantomime flummery of wigs and gowns. And the Bar Council went far enough. They said, all right, we'll take a consumer survey. We'll ask barristers consumers, i.e. we'll ask the criminals. And they took a vote, and they decided they wanted us to keep it. We want our briefs dressed proper. And I think the only time I've been grateful to be wearing a wig and gown was when I had to defend Deep Throat at the Old Bailey. In the days, the first time it surfaced, and it was bad. It was a person who tried to import it was prosecuted for obscenity. And in those days, when I started practice, it was a sex case, so you had to have an all-male jury. And the prosecutor opened the case quite low. He said, members of the jury, you're going to see a film. This will be for you to decide whether it was an indecent import. So the lights went down, and on the screen at the Old Bailey came Linda Lovelace. And 90 minutes later, the lights went up. The judge made his exit in a kind of crouching position. And the jurors just stayed there. The old lady usher, I remember saying, "Come on, it's time for lunch." And still they stayed stock still in the jury box. She said, "Come on, I've got to get me lunch." But still they stayed, those 12 red-faced men of, what is it, good? Men and true. And we barristers, I think, wrapped our gowns loosely around us and were grateful at that time for wigs and gowns. The jury, believe it or not, couldn't make up their mind. They were split. It was what we call a well-hung jury. But now I've got to be careful because I said to the Wheeler Centre, "Well, all right, I'll do a performance." "Oh, no, you mustn't perform, because if you perform, we're going to have to get a license, and it will cost us a lot of money." So I said, "All right, I won't perform. I'll just read my book." And so I'll read you, as I promised the Wheeler Centre, since I won't need a license for doing so, a couple of extracts, and you can decide whether you want to buy it. The most bizarre and most publicized of my cases came in 1995, after a world exclusive in the Sunday Mirror 2 years earlier, which was also a front-page story in Australia and everywhere else. Die Spy Sensation, the most amazing pictures you'll ever see. Photographs spread over 7 pages of Princess Diana exercising on a contraption called a leg press, taken by a camera sneakily hidden in the ceiling of the gym by the owner, Bryce Taylor, an impecunious New Zealander. The princess, out to prove herself after her separation from Prince Charles, was advised, badly as it turned out, to go down in British history by issuing a novel action which would create a hitherto unrecognized civil wrong, invasion of privacy. The High Court judge who first heard her claim thought that such a dramatic change in the law should at least be contested. He extended legal aid to Bryce and asked me to represent him, which would mean having to cross-examine the people's princess. I would need to explore, under cross-examination, Diana's two-faced attitude to privacy. She told the tawdry secrets of her marriage to the journalist Andrew Morton for a book, Diana, Her True Story, which blackened Charles's name. A mock-up courtroom was constructed at Kensington Palace so she could prepare for my cross-examination, and 940 journalists applied for the 75 press seats in Court 36 of the Royal Courts of Justice. The courtroom artists, who produced what were meant to be accurate portraits of court proceedings, but were banned from sketching in court, had already painted our encounter. I was depicted all jowls and splutter, pitted against the Queen of Hearts, radiant in the witness box. Well, I prepared for this case by doing something I'd avoided throughout my life, joining a gym. I even learnt to cardio funk, a type of exercise Diana had also been doing at the gym, which contains funky dance steps with aerobic moves set to hip-hop music. I avoided her choreographed colonics, but learnt the art of toning my buttock muscles on instruments of torture called the life cycle, the rotary torso, the lateral pull-down machine, and the Concept 2 rowing ergometer. The tabloids rejoiced, salivated, in fact, over the upcoming courtroom clash. The Times described me as, quote, anti-establishment, Republican, and Australian, presumably in ascending order of horror. Journalists doorstepped my parents at our Sydney home. What advice would they give the princess?
I would settle out of court, said my father. And so she did. On the evening before what the tabloids were billing as the trial of the century, there was a deal. Her lawyers withdrew the claim after depositing $1 million in Bryce's Swiss bank account. This was all swathed in secrecy, so the princess could claim to have won, although it was an odd sort of victory because the loser was rewarded with a sum greater than the winner had claimed in damages. I cancelled my gym membership, forgot all about cardio funk, and moved on somewhat deflated, as always, when a big case settles at the door of the court. It's a condition my wife calls coitus interruptus. A little later, there was the defense of Mike Tyson. In the year 2000, the Human Rights Act came into force in the United Kingdom, and to national astonishment, its first beneficiary was the American boxer Mike Tyson. He was the youngest heavyweight champion of the world ever at the age of 20 and a convicted rapist a few years later. In 1995, age 34, having served half of his 6-year sentence, he was released. 5 years later, out to regain his heavyweight title from Lennox Lewis, Tyson fought a bout in Glasgow with American Lou Savarese on a freezing night in a hall packed with Scots baying for blood. It wasn't long in flowing. After 12 seconds, Tyson floored Savarese, who went down for a count of 8. "Fight on," said the ref. Unwisely, Savarese could barely stand. Tyson landed a left hook that shook him, and then, as every good boxer would be trained to do in these circumstances, I found myself telling the court, went in for the knockout. At this point, the ref interposed himself and claimed to have said, "Stop boxing." But then, as a result of what I later described as inadvertent contact with Tyson's upper arm, the ref himself went down, and Tyson kept hitting his opponent onto the ropes. After just 38 seconds, the fight ended, and the shaken referee declared Tyson the winner. As microphones were pushed in his face, the victor made some comments that were alleged to be, quote, detrimental to boxing and the public interest. Tyson was hauled before the British Boxing Board of Control, and the media had no doubt, because the board's intention had been leaked, that his license to fight would be cancelled. The case required a delicate examination of the role of hype, which had come to infect this particular sport, an expectation by promoters that boxers would sledge their future opponents to whet the bloodthirsty appetites of a potential audience and thus swell the gate, their profit from the event. It had, in a way, all started with Cassius Clay, otherwise known as Muhammad Ali, but his promises were poetic. "I'm going to float like a butterfly and sting like a bee." After the match, Tyson's declaration to Lennox Lewis was, "I'm coming for you, Lennox Lewis. God, I'm mad. I'm going to rip your heart out and eat your children." My first defense was that, quote, since Lennox Lewis has no children and boxing gloves do not rip through flesh, this comment is ludicrous and fantasized. Not even the law's measure of naivety, the moron in a hurry, would take it seriously or imagine for a moment that it was intended as a real threat. But this argument didn't seem to be convincing the board. So I rolled out the new Human Rights Act, which had to be applied to all public bodies, including the British Boxing Board of Control. It gave particular importance to freedom of speech, which could be curbed only in the interests of public safety or preventing crime, not in the interests of boxing. To take away Tyson's livelihood, punishing him for exercising his free speech right to make tasteless remarks about a future opponent, could open the board to a suit for damages. Besides which, I said, Tyson's remarks were an ironic response to racist stereotyping. You treat me as if I were a jungle savage, so I'll play along with your stereotype. Here, I may have misattributed a degree of sophistication to my client. The truth is that he was so pumped up with adrenaline that in the few minutes after being declared victor, he could have said anything. That's why there was a rule. Radio and television interviews with boxers are not permitted in the ring following a contest, a rule the steward on the night had blatantly breached by allowing the interview. Well, the case went on into the evening, and the board came back merely with a reprimand. I couldn't tell which argument had convinced them not to cancel Tyson's boxing license, although press reports of their decision were headlined, "Tyson lands human rights uppercut to boxing board." Thereafter, the act would benefit many more worthy clients, but the case did make the point that human rights are for everyone, the good, the bad, and the ugly. So, there are a few examples of my time at the Old Bailey. I've spent a very enjoyable weekend, I must tell you, since I'm concentrating on Victoria, at Port Fairy, at the folk festival. There are thousands of really interesting, happy people at that lovely little village on the sea. And it was an opportunity to talk about the songs that inspired me in my youth. Notably, "We Shall Overcome." I actually traced it from an old European folk melody to the Baptist church, "We Will Overcome." And then Pete Seeger, the genius, in a way, of modern protest music, realized that singing "We Will Overcome" isn't right, because will requires a kind of pursing of the lips. So it was his genius that changed the word, just one simple word, shall, which requires the opening of the mouth, the singing out, shall. And he wrote a couple of verses, "We'll walk hand in hand," and so forth, and we are not afraid. And he sang it, September 1957, to Martin Luther King. And King was going on a long car journey, about as long as the trip from Melbourne to Port Fairy. And he couldn't get it out of his head, and he adopted it as his protest song. And of course, it wasn't a revolutionary song, "We Shall Overcome Someday," but it was there throughout the 60s. It was what my students at Sydney sang when they sat down in front of the LBJ motorcade with Robin Askin, the corrupt Prime Minister, screaming, "Run the bastards over!" But it was the song that inspired those protests of the 60s for civil rights, against the apartheid. We played rugby and we played cricket with teams from South Africa selected on racial grounds. Perhaps the most significant thing I did while a student, I interviewed 4 of the Wallabies who'd just come back from a tour of South Africa, and they spoke very movingly of apartheid and of how Australian sporting contacts with South Africa were seen as an endorsement of apartheid and treated as such by the South African government. And at the end of the interview, I asked them, "Will you play against racially selected teams again?" And they said no. And it was terrific because it was published by the Australian. It caused enormous fuss. The Australian Rugby Board attacked them and blacklisted them. And of course, when the South African tour came in 1970, there was Bolte and Askin and Bjelke-Petersen, and the McMahon government were supporting it. And it was the first time that the new leader of the opposition, Gough Whitlam, was able to speak out against it. And the new leader of the Australian Council of Trade Unions, Bob Hawke, actually acted and stopped unions from supporting the tour. And, of course, there was massive protest. Everyone, the protesters sat down on the football field singing, "We shall overcome." And they did, eventually, because Meredith Bergman, my dear friend who was beaten up badly and even jailed by a magistrate, corresponded with Don Bradman, who was head of the Australian Cricket Board, and he finally made his great announcement in 1971 that we wouldn't play cricket with South Africa until they chose non-racially segregated teams. It's extraordinary, isn't it, to think back that we only played against white South African teams, now that a black South African bowler is eviscerating Australian batsmen. But that was another time when "We Shall Overcome" became the anthem of those who had history on their side. I last heard it sung in 1987 in Prague, when I used to go over to Prague in the 80s, active with Václav Havel, who was an extraordinarily courageous playwright, protester, dissident, when the Stalinists in Prague were trying to put him in and out of prison. And we were there for the Jazz Society. They were prosecuting the head of the Jazz Society. And I said to him, "Well, why do fascists hate jazz? Hitler banned it, and now the Stalinists were banning it." And he said, "It's because it's music you can talk under." And I mean, I can't bear jazz. You keep thinking it will turn into a tune, and it doesn't. But they were prosecuting the head of the Jazz Society. Those days when it was telephone justice, we called it, because the judge was a mere puppet of the party, and the party leader would call him up the night before and tell him how long to make the sentence. It's what everyone calls a kangaroo court. Everyone except me. I can't use that phrase. As an Australian, I don't know what our lovable marsupial has done to be identified as with injustice. But it was the Carol Serp, who was the head of the Jazz Society, was sentenced only to 2 years. It was, if we hadn't made an international fuss, he would have got 9 years. And so I walked out with Havel on the court in Charles Square, and there below us were a few hundred demonstrators, and they burst into this ragged chorus of "We Shall Overcome." And I said to Havel, "This is encouraging to hear." And he said to me, "Yes, and on these occasions you always can tell the secret police. They're the ones who know all the words." Well, I've got a few minutes left, and I want to talk about Sergei Magnitsky and Magnitsky laws. You probably haven't heard the name, but it's in every British newspaper today, because it is the long-fought response to an act of cruel and, it would seem, targeted assassination by the Russian state of a Mr. Skripal and his daughter, and almost a police officer who investigated, and many others may be affected. But it goes back to Yeltsin, who was totally corrupt and who allowed very unattractive people, many of them from the KGB, to rip off the state that was collapsing under him. He was a drunkard and a fool. But at this time, there came the oligarchs, and they came to England. They loved England. They loved the ease with which they were able to put their money into English banks. And a lot of them sued newspapers in England whenever their record was mentioned. And I came by that stage, I had a libel practice, and I defended a lot of the newspapers who were sued by the oligarchs. And they were really most unattractive people. One of them left a message on my answering machine, the sound of machine guns firing. And I had one journalist, a very brave American journalist who worked for Forbes, which was a magazine I defended. His name was Paul Klebnikov, and he wrote a searing indictment of Boris Berezovsky, one of the main oligarchs. And of course, after the case, he made the mistake of going back to Moscow, and he was assassinated. One of my clients who just lost his life because of his belief in freedom of speech, and because he went back to a country where if you have money, you simply hire a Chechen assassin. Now, there was a very important case some years ago of a dissident called Litvinenko. He wasn't a very nice dissident. He kept accusing Putin of child molestation and other things that Putin was not guilty of. But because he did that, he was killed by polonium poisoning. And there is proof beyond reasonable doubt of the guilt of his Russian assassins. They left a polonium trail throughout Mayfair. But the British state response, even after a High Court judge at an inquest had said, no doubt from GCHQ transcripts, that Putin had probably approved the assassination, the hit, Britain did nothing. The banks were swollen with Russian oligarchs' money. The Conservative Party, interesting, isn't it, that the Russians always bankroll the right. The Conservative Party had millions in donations from Russian friends of Putin. So we then come to Sergei Magnitsky. Who was he? He was a tax lawyer for some foreign corporations, one of them run by a guy called Bill Browder. And he discovered that 250 million had been extracted from the tax that his corporations had paid and had gone into the pockets of a number of highly placed tax officials and prosecutors. And what he did was to blow the whistle. He complained, he asked for action and an inquiry. And so he was immediately arrested by the very people he'd accused, thrown into prison. He was tortured. He was kept there despite his bad medical condition by lickspittle judges who turned a blind eye when they should have been releasing him on bail. And he was eventually murdered in prison. Well, his client, Bill Browder, would not accept this. He believed that something had to be done for Magnitsky's memory. And finally, of course, he published the truth about how Sergei came to his death. He was sued for libel by one of the policemen he'd accused who came to Britain. He had a salary of $15,000 a year. He put down £1 million to pay for the best libel lawyers in the land. Except for me, I was acting for Bill, and we got the case thrown out. So the next stage was to persuade, to argue that democracy should not permit those who violate human rights to come, to use their banks and to enter their countries. And President Obama in 2012 passed what is called the Global Magnitsky Act, which does exactly that, which names and shames foreign abusers. There were 17 of them, including 3 judges in the Magnitsky case, and the Americans have added more. Canada passed a very powerful Magnitsky law, which enables them not just to freeze the assets of human rights abusers, but to seize them. That's a step forward. I've always argued that there should equally be power to refuse visas to members of the family of human rights abusers, and as well prevent them bringing their parents in for medical treatment. We usually, in the human rights area, try to avoid visiting the sins of the fathers on the children. But I'll never forget the nastiest man, in a way, I've ever investigated. He was an Israeli general who'd been selling arms to the Medellin cartel, to Pablo Escobar. And he begged me not to name him. He said, I only did it for the sake of my children, for my family. So I don't see, I think it's fair enough that Magnitsky laws should extend to banning children from entering to Eton or Geelong Grammar, or to bring their parents to have the benefit of the National Health Service. And the Magnitsky laws have been adopted by the European Union, by a number of countries in Europe. And they are exercises of national sovereignty. It's a good... we have a problem at the moment with international cooperation on criminal justice. I've tried to do something about that ever since the Pinochet case, where I appeared for Human Rights Watch, and then I actually ran a court in Sierra Leone, a United Nations war crimes court, for 5 years, and we were going very well. We had Charles Taylor in prison, we had Milosevic on trial, but since 2011, cooperation has broken down. The international justice movement is struggling ever since 2011. Remember, back then when 800 people had been mown down by Assad's machine guns, I wrote an article saying this is a crime against humanity. It's time that Assad was referred to The Hague by the Security Council. They didn't refer him for... Now there are 450,000 deaths in Syria. The situation has become such that half the population are refugees, either from the country or from their location. Hundreds of children are dying in Ghouta as we speak, and yet the United Nations can do nothing about it because Russia uses its veto. It wants to preserve Assad and preserve its naval base in the Mediterranean. So Magnitsky laws are an opportunity to advance human rights in respect of countries which are democracies, which should say to human rights abusers in foreign lands, you're not coming in for any reason, and names them, shames them, and also is important as a deterrent because they want to come to Western countries to spend their money. They want to use the casinos. They want to take advantage of what they can get. And so Putin, rootin', tootin', shootin' Putin, actually responded to the Obama's Magnitsky Act by, in a puerile way, by banning Americans from adopting Russian orphans. That was his response, but it made him very angry. And finally, Britain this week the Prime Minister at last is talking about Magnitsky amendments. It's a phrase you'll hear again and again. And it raises the question, why shouldn't Australia have a Magnitsky Act, an act that says, for those who come across the sea in private jets, we have no boundless plains to share. We must follow other countries, follow the lead, and stop these people. So it is a time where human rights is at a difficult stage. There is a lack of cooperation on international justice. And people are always asking me, don't you despair? And I did actually respond towards the end of my book. Don't you despair, people often ask. I do not, because belief in human rights takes hold in small places and slowly spreads. I've observed how far my own country, Australia, has moved since I grew up in it to embrace beliefs that used to get us a police bashing. I've seen how the tyrants to whom we once wrote in amnesty pathetic letters have later been arrested for their tyranny, how electronic communication has brought into being the global witness, and I've watched how those of my children's generation have come to value the rights of people with whom, at their age, I was never concerned. My daughter became a SRC president, always concerned with the rights of cleaners, justice for cleaners. We would never have thought of the cleaning staff in the 60s. And for all the enormity of our present problems, refugees, terrorism, climate change, Trump et al., the life I've sketched in this book has left me with faith in the one human quality that ultimately defines us as human. Not our power to speak or reason or love or to subdue base instincts or achieve autonomy or worship gods, but our counterfactual capability for kindness. Human rights standards reflect our capacity to care for others and for future others. And that's why I believe they're worth fighting for. Thank you.
Visit realcentre.com for the best in books, writing and ideas from Melbourne, Australia and the world.